The fire snapped and threw long shadows across the ring of warriors, and John Prescott stood in the middle of it with his wrists bound and his heart hammering, certain he was about to die among people who had every right to hate him. The elders sat on stones worn smooth by generations, stone-faced, already lifting their hands to cast the count that would decide his fate. He could hear the murmur building, the low growl of agreement rolling through the gathered clan like distant thunder. Then a voice cut through all of it, sharp as a blade drawn from its sheath. "Stop the vote!" Every head turned. Dura Fireblood strode into the firelight with her chin high and her hand resting on the hilt of her long knife, and even bound and terrified, John felt something in his chest loosen just at the sight of her. "I would know his answer," she said, "before I hear yours." The elders stared at her. John stared at her too, uncomprehending, his pulse roaring in his ears. She turned from them and looked only at him, and in that look was every soft thing she had never let her own people see. "Do you approve of me," she asked him in front of all of them, "or not?" To understand how a mountain trapper came to stand bound before an orc war camp with a chieftess demanding his heart in front of her whole clan, one had to go back 2 months, to the last golden weeks before the snow, when the whole valley smelled of crushed apples and wood smoke, and the border town of Fallbrook Crossing swelled fat with the biggest harvest fair in 3 counties. John Prescott had worked the high trapping line above Fallbrook for 11 years, ever since he was young enough to still believe hard work alone could buy a man a good life. He was not a large man, not the kind who filled a doorway or turned heads in a crowded room. His hands were scarred from wire snares and skinning knives, his face weathered brown from wind and sun, and his eyes were a tired, patient gray that made most people assume, wrongly, that there was nothing much going on behind them. He kept to himself on the mountain most of the year, checking his lines, curing hides, trading only when he had to. Folks in town were polite enough to his face and forgot him the moment he turned his back. He had got used to being a man people looked past. He told himself he did not mind it. That autumn he came down out of the high country with 2 mules loaded heavy with marten and fox, and a single silver-tipped wolf pelt he was proud enough of to charge double for. And he came down specifically for the Fallbrook Harvest Fair, because it was the one time each year the whole world seemed to gather in one place, and even a lonely man could stand at the edge of it and feel, for a few days, like he belonged to something larger than his own silence. The fair sprawled across the meadow below the town walls like its own small kingdom. Canvas stalls in long, crooked rows sold cider and salt pork and bolts of dyed wool. Farmers argued over the price of grain. Children chased a squealing pig between the legs of a dozen adults who did not appreciate it. Fiddlers competed with each other from opposite ends of the field, and somewhere a blacksmith's hammer kept time like a heartbeat under it all. And this year, for the first time in John's memory, a delegation from the Orc clans had come down out of the eastern hills to trade under the fragile 10-year treaty that had ended, if not the old hatred, at least the old open war. He saw her before he knew her name, and he did not forget the sight of her for the rest of his life. She stood near the horse pens, arguing with a trader over the price of good rope, and she moved like something built for war that had chosen, for the moment, to be patient. She was tall even among her own kind, easily a head above John, with skin the deep green-gray of river stone and black hair bound back in a thick braid threaded with small bronze rings that caught the afternoon light. She wore fitted leather armor the color of dark earth, a bodice laced tight up the front that hugged the powerful lines of her body and left her strong arms bare, banded at each wrist with hammered copper, and a long knife rode her hip beside a curved short sword whose worn grip spoke of a hand that used it often and well. Every line of her said warrior, said leader, said do not mistake me for anything soft. And yet there was something in the set of her mouth, faintly amused at the trader's stammering, that told John she was enjoying herself. He should have kept walking. He told himself that later many times. Instead he stopped, mule rope still in hand, and watched her the way a man watches weather rolling in over the mountains, half in awe and half in dread. The trader, red-faced and sweating despite the cool day, was trying to charge her triple for rope that John knew for a fact was worth barely a copper coin a length, banking on the crowd's fear to keep her from arguing too hard in public. John had seen this particular trader cheat drunk soldiers and frightened widows alike. It made something in his chest go tight and stubborn. "That rope's not worth half that," John said, before he had decided to say anything at all. The trader's head snapped toward him. The orc woman's head turned too, slower, more measuring, gold-flecked brown eyes settling on him with an attention that made his mouth go dry. "I beg your pardon," the trader said stiffly. "I said it's not worth it. I buy that same coil for a third of the price at the trading post on the North Road. You're charging her because you think she won't argue in front of a crowd." John met the trader's glare without flinching, though his heart was going hard enough that he was fairly sure everyone within 20 feet could hear it. Sell it fair or don't sell it. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the orc woman laughed, low and genuinely startled, and the sound of it did something strange and warm to the inside of John's chest. "He is right," she said to the trader, her voice carrying the rough music of her people's accent over common speech, deep and unhurried. "Fair price, or I will simply take my coin to someone who does not think me a fool." The trader, flustered and outnumbered, dropped his price without further argument. She paid him, took her coil of rope, and turned to look at John properly for the first time, tilting her head as though he were a puzzle she had not expected to find at a harvest fair. "You did not have to do that," she said. "Didn't seem right watching," John admitted. "Man like that thinks folks will stay quiet on account of what you look like. Seemed worth proving him wrong." Something shifted in her expression, quick and unguarded, before she smoothed it away. "Most men in this valley would not spend a word helping one of my kind, let alone spend an argument on it. I'm not most men." He said it plainly without boast, the way he'd have told her the weather. "Name's John Prescott. I trapped the high line above the town. Dura Fireblood." She said it like a fact she was used to seeing land with weight, and when it did not seem to intimidate him, something like curiosity sparked behind her eyes. "Chieftess of my clan, for whatever that is worth to a man who sells furs." "Worth plenty, I expect, though I wouldn't know the particulars." He risked a small smile. "Chieftess Fireblood, pleased to meet you." She studied him a moment longer than politeness required, her gaze traveling briefly, frankly, over him in a way that made heat climb his neck. "The pleasure," she said finally, "is unexpected, but not unwelcome, Trapper John Prescott." They spoke longer than either of them likely intended, there among the horse pens with the fair noise rolling around them, about the price of pelts and the stubbornness of mules, and the way the mountain wind changed 3 days before a real storm came. She was sharp, and she did not soften her opinions for his comfort, and every time she laughed at something he said, low and surprised, John felt it land somewhere under his ribs like a hook he had not seen coming. When she finally excused herself to return to her delegation's camp at the fair's edge, she looked back once over her shoulder, and he stood there like a fool grinning after her long after she had gone. He told himself it meant nothing. He told himself that for 2 more days, right up until the moment everything went to pieces. It happened on the 3rd day of the fair, in the golden hour before dusk when the crowds were thickest and the cider was flowing free, and nobody was watching closely enough to see trouble creeping in at the edges. A wealthy grain trader named Merrick Voss was found behind the granary stalls with his throat cut and his coin purse untouched, which should have told anyone thinking clearly that robbery was not the motive. But thinking clearly was in short supply once a hard-eyed bounty hunter named Roran Blackfin came striding through the crowd holding up a hunting knife with orc-worked bronze on the hilt, claiming he had found it not 6 feet from the body, and that he recognized the maker's mark as belonging to none other than the Fireblood clan's own chieftess. John was near enough to hear the crowd's mood turn, like a held breath finally releasing into a shout. He had spent the last hour trading with a leatherworker 2 stalls down, and had, by pure chance of timing, watched Dura leave her clan's camp not a quarter hour before the body was found and walk in the opposite direction entirely, toward the river to fill water skins, nowhere near the granary. He knew, with the plain certainty of a man who trusted his own eyes, that the timing did not fit. But certainty did not matter to a crowd already frightened and already primed by 20 years of half-forgotten war stories to believe the worst of anyone green-skinned. By the time John pushed his way to the front of the gathering mob, they had already dragged Dura from her tent, and someone had lashed her wrists together with cart rope, and Roarin' Blackfin stood over her holding a rifle loosely, lazily, the way a man holds a weapon when he is entirely confident no one will challenge him. "String her up," someone shouted from the back, and the crowd took up the cry like it was the easiest thing in the world. Dura did not beg. She knelt in the trampled grass with her bound wrists in her lap and her chin raised, and there was such fury and such contempt in her eyes, aimed not at her captors but at her own helplessness, that it struck John harder than any plea for mercy could have. "That knife isn't hers," John said, loud enough to carry, pushing through the press of bodies. "I saw her walk to the river before Voss was even found. She wasn't anywhere near the granary." "And who in the 9 hells are you," Blackfin said, not even bothering to look at him fully, "to tell good folk what they saw with their own eyes? I'm telling you what I saw with mine." John's heart was slamming against his ribs, every instinct screaming at him that this was not a fight he could win, that a mob did not care for reasoned argument, that a rifle in a stranger's hands was not a thing to be trifled with. He kept walking anyway, until he stood between the crowd and the kneeling woman, close enough now to see the fine tremor of restrained rage in Dura's shoulders. "You want to hang somebody for what happened to Voss, you'd best be certain first. That knife could have been planted easy as anything. Any man here could have walked past her camp and lifted it while she slept." "He's protecting his orc whore," someone jeered, and the ugliness of it rippled through the crowd, and John felt his own fear curdle into something harder. He knelt deliberately in front of Dura, drawing his skinning knife from his belt in full view of everyone so no one could claim he meant a hidden violence. Her eyes met his, startled, wary, searching his face for whatever trick this might be. "I'm going to cut you loose," he said quietly, only for her. "You're going to have to trust me for about 10 seconds. Can you do that?" "You are either very brave or very foolish, trapper," she murmured back, but she did not pull away, and when the blade parted the rope at her wrists she flexed her fingers once, testingly, and looked at him with something that was not quite gratitude and not quite disbelief. "Get her out of here." Someone shouted, and the crowd surged forward as one animal, and Blackfin's rifle came up, and for one heartbeat John thought that was going to be the end of it, right there in the trampled grass with the smell of cider and wood smoke still hanging sweet in the air. Then Dura moved. She came up off her knees in a single fluid motion, caught John's arm, and hauled him bodily out of the rifle's line as she spun and drove her boot into a nearby cart, wheel hard enough to send it rolling into the front of the mob, scattering the closest men off their feet in a tangle of curses and flailing limbs. In the chaos that followed, she did not draw her knife on a single soul, did not so much as raise a fist against them, though John had no doubt she could have carved a bloody path through half the crowd if she had chosen to. Instead she grabbed his wrist and he ran with her, past the overturned cart, past shouting stall keepers, out beyond the last canvas tent and into the tree line at the meadow's edge, Blackfin's furious voice chasing after them and a scattering rifle shot cracking somewhere behind, wide and useless in the failing light. They ran until the fair's noise faded to a distant murmur beneath the sound of their own ragged breathing, until the trees closed thick around them, and the last of the sun bled orange through the high branches. Only then did Dura stop, pressing her back against a broad old oak, chest heaving, and look at John as though seeing him for the first time all over again. "You should not have done that," she said between breaths. "Probably not." He bent over, hands on his knees, trying to remember how his own lungs worked. Didn't seem right letting them string you up on a bounty hunter's word and a knife you never touched. You do not even know me. Know enough. He straightened, meeting her eyes despite the fear still thundering through him. No, you didn't do it. No, a mob doesn't care much for the truth once it's decided what it wants. Figured somebody ought to slow them down long enough for the truth to catch up. She studied him for a long moment in the dimming light, something unreadable moving behind her gold-brown eyes, and then, unexpectedly, she reached out and gripped his forearm orc fashion, the way John had seen warriors greet each other with respect rather than the soft human clasp of hands. "Then I am in your debt, John Prescott," she said. "A debt I do not offer lightly." "Don't need a debt," he said. "Just needed it to be right." "That," she said quietly, "is precisely why it matters." Behind them, distant but unmistakable, came the baying of hounds and the shout of men organizing a hunt, and whatever tenderness had crept into the moment hardened instantly into urgency. "We cannot stay here," Dura said. "Blackfin will not let this go. Men like him do not chase bounties for justice. Someone paid him well to see me hang, and a witness who saw the truth is now as much a threat to him as I am." John looked back toward the glow of the fair's torches through the trees, thought of his cabin on the mountain, his trapping line, the quiet solitary life he had built for himself, and felt it all fall away like water through his fingers. "Then I suppose we run," he said, and did not let himself examine too closely why the prospect frightened him less than it should have. They ran through the first night without stopping more than a few minutes at a time, following deer trails John knew from 11 years of working these mountains, cutting east and then north in a wide loop meant to throw off any dogs. Dura moved through the dark with a silent, economical grace that put his own careful woodcraft to shame, and more than once it was her hand on his shoulder, pulling him down behind a fallen log or a stand of brush, that kept him from stumbling into open ground where a torch might have caught him. By the second day they had put enough distance behind them to risk a fire, small and well hidden in a hollow between two granite outcrops that John knew from years of running his trapping line nearby. He shot a brace of grouse with the old bow he carried more out of habit than confidence, and Dura, watching him work the birds over the flame with quick, practiced hands, seemed genuinely surprised. "You are not what I expected from a human," she admitted, sitting across the fire with her knees drawn up, the firelight catching the copper at her wrists. "What do you expect? Someone louder, someone who needed to prove himself with words." She tilted her head. "You simply do things. It is a strange quality in a man. Didn't figure I had much worth proving." He turned the birds carefully, not meeting her eyes. "Folks around Fallbrook mostly look right through me. Not much good at making myself noticed." "I noticed you," she said simply, and something in the plain honesty of it made his hand still over the fire. "Reckon you did," he said, and when he finally looked up she was watching him with an intensity that made the whole night feel smaller, closer, charged with something neither of them had named yet. They survived together in the days that followed, and surviving together, John came to learn, had a way of stripping two people down to what actually mattered. He taught her the human trick of setting snares that would hold even a canny fox, and she showed him, with visible amusement at his clumsy first attempts, how to read the deep old orc trail signs cut into certain trees, marks left generations ago that still guided a traveler safely through disputed ground. When a sudden mountain storm caught them exposed on a scree slope and sent loose rocks sliding beneath John's boots, it was Dura's hand that closed like an iron band around his wrist and hauled him bodily back from the drop before he had even finished losing his footing. And afterward she did not let go of his hand for a long moment, her thumb tracing absently over his knuckles as though reassuring herself he was still there and whole. And when, 3 nights later, Blackfin's men found their trail sooner than either of them expected and came upon their camp in the gray hour before dawn, it was John who woke first at the crack of a twig, who threw himself against her before he had even fully understood the danger. knocking them both clear of the crossbow bolt that thudded into the log where she had been sleeping a heartbeat before. They fought their way clear together in the confused dark, John swinging a burning branch to scatter one attacker while Dura disarmed another with brutal economical efficiency. And by the time the sun rose, they were breathless and shaking and alive, and something between them had shifted into a register neither could pretend not to notice any longer. "You threw yourself in front of a bolt for me," she said afterward, as they sat catching their breath against a boulder, her hands still not quite steady. "Wasn't thinking, just moved." He looked at her, at the fine tremor still in her shoulders, at the fierce, uncertain look in her eyes that he had never seen there before. "Would do it again." "That is a foolish thing to say to a woman who could break you in half," she said, but her voice had gone soft, and she was closer to him now than the danger required, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating off her skin, close enough that when her gaze dropped to his mouth he felt it like a physical touch. "Maybe," he said. "Don't much care." She made a low sound, something between a laugh and a groan, and then her hand was at the back of his neck and she was kissing him, hard and hungry and unhesitating, and John's whole world narrowed down to the taste of her mouth, and the strength of her grip, and the wild, impossible fact that she wanted this every bit as much as he did. He kissed her back with all the pent-up longing of a man who had spent 11 years believing no one would ever look at him twice, and when they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, she rested her forehead against his and laughed, low and disbelieving. "I did not intend that," she admitted. "Not sorry it happened," John said, and felt her smile against his skin. "Nor am I," she said, "which frightens me more than any bounty hunter." They traveled slower after that, not because the danger had lessened, but because some unspoken agreement had settled between them that they were no longer simply two strangers thrown together by necessity. Dura began to tell him, in unhurried pieces around the evening fire, about her clan, about the weight of leading people who had buried fathers and brothers in the last war, and had not fully forgiven the peace, about the elders who watched her every decision for weakness, about the neighboring Ashfang clan's chieftain, Gorath, who had made it known through intermediaries that he expected her to accept a political marriage to bind their two clans against exactly the kind of human aggression that had just tried to hang her on false evidence. "You don't want that," John said, watching her face in the firelight. "I want what is best for my people," she said carefully. "Oreth is not a cruel man. He would not mistreat me. But I have never wanted him, John Prescott, and I find that the longer I sit beside you, the less patience I have for pretending that does not matter to me." "Reckon I feel something a lot like that myself," he admitted, and reached across the small space between them to take her hand, and she let him, threading her thick calloused fingers through his without hesitation, and they sat like that a long while, saying nothing more, needing nothing more said. It was 2 nights later, after they had put real distance behind them and dared to believe, for the first time, that they might have shaken Blackfin's pursuit, that the last of their restraint finally gave way. They had made camp in a sheltered hollow beside a stream, the autumn night mild and full of stars, and John had been repairing a torn strap on his pack when Dura simply crossed the small distance between them and knelt in front of him, taking his face in both her hands with a gentleness that seemed almost unbearable coming from someone so powerful. "I have chosen many things in my life," she said quietly. "Alliances, battles, which of my warriors to trust with my back turned. I have never chosen anything the way I find myself wanting to choose you. Dura, let me finish." Her thumb traced the line of his jaw. "Among my people, when a woman claims a mate, it is not a small thing. It is a mark and a bond, and it cannot be undone once it is given. I would not offer it lightly, and I would not offer it to a man I did not trust with everything I am." She hesitated, searching his eyes. "I am offering it to you, John Prescott, if you will have it." His heart was pounding so hard he was certain she could feel it. "I don't rightly know your customs," he said honestly, "but I know I've never wanted anything the way I want to stay beside you. Whatever that mark means, Whatever it costs either of us, I'll take it, and I'll take you if you're truly asking." "I am asking," she said, and there was nothing of the chieftess in her voice then, only a woman laying her heart down in front of a man she had decided, against every wise instinct, to trust completely. What passed between them after that was tender and fierce and unhurried, lit only by the low fire and the wheeling stars overhead, and John would remember every part of it for the rest of his life. The warmth of her skin against his, the low sound she made against his throat, the careful, deliberate press of her teeth at the joint of his shoulder that left a mark neither pain nor pleasure alone could describe. Sealed a moment later with words spoken low and rough in her own tongue, that he did not understand, yet felt land somewhere permanent inside his chest. When it was over, they lay tangled together beneath a shared blanket, her head on his chest, his hand tracing slow, idle circles on her bare shoulder, and neither of them spoke, because there was nothing that needed saying that the night had not already said for them. They woke at first light to the sound of horses. John surfaced from sleep with Dura's arm still draped across him, the fire long since burned to embers, and for one disoriented moment he thought the sound was simply another dream. Then Dura went rigid beside him, and he opened his eyes fully to see 6 mounted Fireblood scouts ringing their small camp, weapons drawn, staring down at the two of them with expressions ranging from shock to open horror. At their head sat a broad-shouldered warrior John did not recognize, his face carved from stone, his eyes fixed with unmistakable, furious disbelief on the fresh claiming mark visible at the joint of John's shoulder where the blanket had slipped. "Chieftess," the warrior said, his voice thick with something between disgust and disbelief, "what have you done?" Dura rose slowly, gathering what dignity a person could when caught bare beneath a shared blanket by her own honor guard, and there was no shame in the way she faced them, only a fierce, wounded pride. "I have chosen my own mate, Karg," she said, "as is my right. With a human," the warrior's gaze cut to John like a blade. "The elders sent us to find you before Blackfin's lies reached the Ashfang and undid the treaty entirely, and we find you have handed them a truth far worse than any lie he could have invented. A chieftess, claimed by an outsider without counsel, without ceremony. This is not your right alone to take, Dura. You know the old law as well as I." "I know the old law," Dura said, and for the first time John heard real fear beneath her fury, not for herself. He understood with a sick lurch, but for him. "And I know it will fall on him harder than on me." They were not given the chance to argue further. The scouts bound John's wrists, not roughly but not gently either, and though Dura fought to keep herself between him and their weapons every step of the 2-day ride back to the Fireblood war camp, John saw in her eyes the same dread that had settled cold and heavy in his own chest. That the reckless, beautiful night that had rewritten everything between them might now be the very thing that destroyed him. The Fireblood war camp sprawled across a wide highland valley, dozens of hide tents arranged around a great central fire pit, smoke rising from cook fires into a sky already turning toward winter gray. Word of their arrival had clearly outpaced them, because the entire camp seemed to have turned out to watch as the scouts led John, bound, through the rows of tents toward the elders' council circle, Dura riding grim and silent beside him, her jaw set against the murmurs and stares that followed them. They separated him from her that first night, penning him in a small guarded tent at the camp's edge with 2 stern-faced warriors posted outside, and John spent the long dark hours alone with nothing but his own fear for company, certain he had traded a mob's rope for something worse. It was 2 days before the elders convened a full hearing, days John spent in tense isolation, catching only glimpses of Dura moving grim-faced between the elders' tents, clearly fighting battles he could not see. When they finally brought him before the council fire, hands still bound, he found the entire clan gathered in a wide circle beneath the open sky, firelight dancing off dozens of watchful faces, and at the head of the circle sat 5 elders on weathered stones, with Dura standing apart from them. Forbidden, John understood from her rigid posture, from speaking on her own behalf until called. The first matter, mercifully, was resolved swiftly and in their favor. John had carried, sewn carefully into the lining of his pack through every mile of their flight, a scrap of parchment he had lifted from Roran Blackfin's own saddlebag during the chaos of the ambush at their camp, a signed contract bearing the seal of a human lord named Aldrich Wexley, promising Blackfin a substantial payment for the death of Merrick Voss, and the framing of the Orc Chieftess Fireblood, to shatter the treaty and open Fireblood hunting grounds to human settlement. John presented it now with bound hands to the eldest of the council, a stooped, sharp-eyed woman named Ussa, who read it aloud to a swelling murmur of outrage through the gathered clan. "This clears the Chieftess of Voss's death beyond any doubt," Ussa announced. "We will send this to Fallbrook's own magistrate with our own witnesses, and see Blackfin and his human lord answer for it before human law as well as ours." Her sharp eyes moved to John. "This much, Trapper, we owe you thanks for. It is the other matter that remains." The other matter. John felt Dura's eyes on him from across the fire, fierce and afraid in equal measure, and understood that the true trial was only beginning. Karg, the scout captain who had found them, stood to speak first, and his voice carried the weight of old grievance and older law. "The Chieftess has claimed an outsider, a human, without council consent, without ceremony, without so much as a warning to her own people. Whatever debt this man is owed for the matter of Voss, it does not erase what has been done. Our law says clearly, a Chieftess's mate is chosen for the clan's strength, not for her own heart's wandering. We were already promised to the Ashfang through her marriage to Gorath. That promise cannot be broken on the strength of a few nights in the wilderness with a man who does not even carry a warrior's blade." A chorus of low agreement rippled through the gathered clan, and John felt the ground shift beneath the fragile hope he had been carrying since the parchment's reading. Beside Karg, a broad, heavily scarred orc John did not recognize rose as well, and from the way the crowd's attention sharpened, John understood this must be Gorath himself, come to press his own claim in person. "The Fireblood Chieftess's word is not so easily undone," Gorath said, his voice deep and unhurried, though his eyes when they found John held nothing but contempt. "I do not fault her for finding comfort with a man who saved her life. Gratitude is understandable. But gratitude is not a foundation for leading a clan, and this human cannot stand beside her in war, cannot speak our counsels, cannot even lift a Fireblood blade with any skill. I say the claim is nullified by the elder's authority, the marriage proceeds as agreed, and the human is sent home with his life, which is more mercy than our law strictly requires." Murmurs of agreement swelled louder this time, and Ussa raised one weathered hand for the count, the ancient gesture that would open the formal vote, each elder to cast a stone into one of two baskets to decide John's fate, and with it, Dura's future entirely. It was in that exact breath, stones already lifting from elder hands toward the baskets, that Dura Fireblood stepped forward into the center of the circle, her voice ringing out clear and unshakable over the assembled clan. "Stop the vote." Every stone paused midair, every head turned. John, still bound, still braced for whatever judgment was coming, felt his heart lurch at the sheer, defiant fire in her stance. "Chieftess," Ussa said carefully, "the council has heard both sides. This is not a matter for interruption." "It is precisely a matter for interruption," Dura said, "because you have forgotten something the old law also demands, elder, in your haste to decide a man's fate for him." She turned then fully to face John, and the crowd's murmur died into absolute silence. "The right of voice has not been invoked in 3 generations, but it stands in our law still. When a claim has been made and sealed before any council may nullify it, the one claimed must be asked before all the clan whether he accepts it freely. Not asked in a tent, not asked through a scout, asked here before the fire where all may witness his answer." Her voice caught, just slightly, the only crack in her formidable composure. "I will not have his fate decided as though he is a prize to be awarded or withheld. I will not have my people speak for his heart when he has one of his own to speak with. Goreth's face darkened. This is a technicality dragged up to delay the inevitable. It is the law, Ussa said slowly, and something in her ancient eyes suggested she was not entirely displeased to see it invoked. The chieftess speaks true. The right of voice stands unbroken in our histories. If the man refuses the claim, it dissolves on its own, and the vote may proceed as planned. If he accepts it freely before witnesses, she paused, weighing old law against present politics, then no council may nullify what has already been chosen by both hearts, and the marriage to Goreth cannot proceed. Every eye in the gathered clan turned to John Prescott, bound and travel-worn, a trapper from the mountains above Fallbrook Crossing, who had never in his life imagined standing at the center of so many watching faces. Dura crossed the remaining distance between them, and with her own hands, cut the rope binding his wrists. The old gesture between them repeated now in reverse, and cupped his face exactly as she had that night beside the stream. "Do you approve of me?" she asked, quiet enough now that it felt like they were the only two people in the world, though every soul in the camp could hear it. Or not? "Tell me now," John Prescott, in front of all of them, so that no one, not my council, not Goreth, not even you in some quiet doubting hour years from now, can ever say this was decided for you instead of by you. John looked at her, at the fierce, powerful, unshakable woman who had chosen him, a lonely trapper nobody in his own town had ever thought twice about, over a political marriage that would have secured her clan's future without risk, and felt something in his chest crack open wide with a feeling too large for the word love alone to hold. "I approve," he said, loud enough now that his own voice carried clear across the circle. "I approve of you, Dura Fireblood, more than I've ever approved of anything in my whole life. I didn't come looking for this. Didn't think a woman like you would ever look twice at a man like me. But I choose you, not out of gratitude, not out of some debt owed. I choose you because you're the finest thing that's ever happened to me, and I'd rather stand here and let your whole clan decide whether to run me off the mountain than spend one more day pretending I don't want you beside me for the rest of my life." A stunned silence held the circle for one long heartbeat. Then Dura let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob, and kissed him fiercely in front of her entire clan, uncaring of Goreth's thunderous expression or the elders' scandalized murmurs, and John kissed her back with everything he had, feeling the mark on his shoulder pulse warm beneath his shirt, as though it recognized the moment for what it was. When they finally broke apart, Ussa rose from her stone with the slow deliberation of a woman who had seen many claims and few so honestly won. "The right of voice has been answered freely before witnesses," she declared. "By our own law, the claim stands and cannot be undone by council vote." Goreth's jaw worked, but even he seemed to recognize the futility of arguing further against both law and the visible devotion between them. "The clan needs strength," he said finally, gruffly, "not only in marriage. If this man wishes to stand beside our chieftess, let him prove he understands something of what that costs." Karg nodded slowly, some of the hostility in his face giving way to grudging consideration. "The trial of fire," he said. "It has not been demanded of an outsider in living memory, but it is fitting for a man who would join the Fireblood line. Let him hold the burning brand the length of a spoken vow, without flinching, and no, he does not fear what our name means." John did not fully understand the custom, but he understood the weight in Dura's eyes when she looked at him, torn between pride and worry. "You do not have to," she said quietly, "only for him. I have already answered for my own heart. You owe them nothing further." "I want to," John said, and meant it. "Your people deserve to see I mean what I said." They brought a thick branch from the central fire, one end wrapped tight in oiled hide and burning steady, and John took it in his bare hand as Ussa spoke the old words of the trial, something about fire testing what was true and burning away what was false. He held the burning brand as she spoke, feeling the heat bite fiercely into his palm, sweat breaking cold along his spine, but he kept his eyes fixed on Dura's face across the fire, and did not let so much as a tremor show, until Ussa finished the final word, and John set the brand down into the coals, his hand reddened and blistering but his composure unbroken. A murmur of genuine respect rolled through the gathered clan this time, warriors who had watched countless trials nodding slowly among themselves, and even Gorath inclined his head a fraction, a warrior's acknowledgment of another man's courage, however unconventional its source. "The vote may proceed," Ussa announced, "on the matter that remains whether this clan formally welcomes John Prescott as mate to our chieftess, bound by claim and right of voice and trial of fire alike." This time when the stones fell into the baskets, John watched Dura's face rather than the count itself, watched the fierce hope she could not quite hide beneath her chieftess's composure, and when Ussa finally announced the count, overwhelmingly in favor, all but 2 elders casting their stones for acceptance, Dura crossed the circle and pulled him into an embrace that lifted him clean off his feet, laughing, careless of dignity for the first time since he had met her. "You absolute fool," she murmured against his ear, "holding fire for me." "Would have held worse," he murmured back, and felt her arms tighten around him in answer. The matter of Merrick Voss's murder and Roran Blackfin's treachery resolved itself within the fortnight that followed, the Fireblood elders sending Ussa herself along with a small honor guard to Fallbrook Crossing to present the signed contract before the town magistrate. Blackfin, cornered by evidence he could not talk his way around and abandoned swiftly by the frightened Lord Wexley the moment his scheme unraveled, was taken into custody by the town guard within days. Wexley's own household staff, eager to avoid the noose alongside their master, provided testimony enough to see him stripped of his lands and standing before winter's first snow. The treaty between Fallbrook and the clans, badly shaken by the whole affair, held firm in the end, strengthened rather than broken by the very scandal that had nearly destroyed it. For word spread quickly through both town and camp of the trapper who had risked his own neck for a chieftess wrongly accused, and of the chieftess who had chosen her own heart over a political marriage in front of her whole assembled clan. It made for a story people liked to tell, embellished a little more with each telling, and John found, to his lasting bemusement, that he could no longer walk through Fallbrook's market square without someone clapping him on the shoulder and asking after the chieftess, as though he had become, almost overnight, a man people actually noticed. A year turned over slow and full since that night by the council fire, and John Prescott found himself, on a crisp autumn morning very like the one that had started everything, standing once more at the edge of the Fallbrook Harvest Fair with Dura Fireblood beside him, her hand loose and warm in his. No rope, no accusation, no crowd turning ugly at the sight of them together. They had built a life between 2 worlds in the months since the trial, splitting the turning seasons between his cabin on the high trapping line, where Dura had surprised him entirely by taking a fierce, competitive pride in learning to set a proper snare line of her own, and the Fireblood camp in the eastern hills, where John had slowly, patiently earned a rough, comfortable place among warriors who had once looked at him with open suspicion and now greeted him by name, sharing meat from their own fires without a second thought. Karg, of all people, had become something like a gruff friend, teaching John the proper grip for a Fireblood short blade with the same blunt patience he once reserved for the clan's own young warriors. Gorath had, in the end, made his peace with the outcome and found a wife of his own choosing among the Ashfang the following spring, and sent word of it to Dura with what John understood to be genuine, if characteristically terse, goodwill. The mark at John's shoulder had faded from angry red to a pale, permanent silver-white scar shaped faintly like a flame, and Dura traced it sometimes in the quiet dark of their cabin with a possessive tenderness that never failed to steal his breath, murmuring in her own tongue words he had finally, patiently, learned to understand. Mine, chosen, kept. They walked together now through the same rows of canvas stalls where they had first met, past the horse pens where a chastened trader, the very same one from the year before sold rope at an honest price without needing to be told twice, and stopped at last near the edge of the meadow where the fiddle music drifted loudest, the whole valley golden with the last light of the dying afternoon. "You are smiling like a fool," Dura observed, arching a brow at him, though her own mouth curved with matching warmth. "Reckon I've got reason to." John looked out over the fair, the crowds, the ordinary bustling life of a world that had once looked right through him, and then back at the woman beside him who never had, who had stood in front of her entire clan and demanded that his own voice matter before any council's vote could decide his fate. "Never figured a man like me would end up here. Chosen and kept, and not one bit alone." "You were never as unremarkable as you believed yourself to be," Dura said, low, sincere, lacing her fingers more firmly through his. "It only took someone willing to truly look. Lucky for me you did." "Lucky," she agreed, "for both of us." She kissed him then, unhurried and certain, right there at the edge of the harvest fair with the whole valley humming gold and orange around them. And John Prescott, who had spent 11 long years believing himself destined to be overlooked, understood at last, fully and without a shadow of doubt, exactly what it meant to be chosen, wanted, and never, ever alone again.